It's the early morning of November the 13th, 1942, and an imposing Japanese bombardment force of 2 battlecruisers, 1 light cruiser and 9 destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral Abe, is sailing through a massive thunderstorm, scattering elements of the Japanese force on their way to bombard Henderson Field. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, an American task force of 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral Callahan, is on a collision course with them. The battle that follows would become one of the most savage nighttime naval battles of the Second World War. Earlier in the year, the first American offensive in the Pacific Theatre began when the 1st Marine Division conducted an amphibious assault on the strategically important islands of Tulagi, Gavutu Tanambogo and Guadalcanal, where the Japanese had been building an airfield. Almost immediately, Guadalcanal becomes the focus of savage fighting in the air, land and sea. Throughout much of the Guadalcanal campaign, many in the Japanese military downplay the scale of the American presence and commitment to retain Guadalcanal. But now, after the failure of the latest Japanese army attack against Henderson Field at the end of October, the Japanese understand the battle for Guadalcanal represents a decisive moment in the war, and decide to send a convoy of 11 large transport ships to provide the Japanese army the resources they need to finally crush the US Marines on Guadalcanal. To support this effort, the Japanese Navy sets out to bombard the now US Navy and Marine used airfield on Guadalcanal known as Henderson Field. However, what the Japanese do not know is that despite recent losses, the US Navy has managed to scrape together a task force of cruisers and destroyers with the unenviable mission of trying to stop the Japanese bombardment. In the dark waters off Guadalcanal, events will soon spiral out of control. Having altered course just after midnight to avoid the worst of the thunderstorms, Abe's force becomes scattered, and he is unaware that 3 of the destroyers he wants ahead screening his battlecruisers are actually behind him, and the 2 that are ahead are not far enough ahead to provide adequate warning of American warships. Over at the American task force, at 1:24 AM, radar on USS Helena picks up the first of the Japanese destroyers. However, Admiral Callahan on USS San Francisco, which lacks Helena's superior SG radar, is receiving only confused radio reports from his ships, and without a clear understanding of what is happening, at 1:37 AM, orders the task force to turn north, hoping to cross the T of the Japanese force. However, Callahan's task force is actually now heading straight towards the Japanese fleet. Oblivious to what is unfolding, Abe orders preparations for the bombardment to begin. Minutes later, destroyer USS Cushing spots the 2 lead Japanese destroyers and turns left in readiness to bring them under fire. The 3 destroyers following her also veer left. Becoming overwhelmed with more and more radar reports, Callahan attempts to gain control of the situation and at 1:45 AM issues the order, stand by to open fire, but then just 2 minutes later orders a return to a northerly course. This throws the American formation into chaos, as the cruisers have to veer to port to avoid the destroyers. Close by, the Japanese finally realise an American task force is almost on top of them, and at 1:48 AM, searchlights from battlecruiser Hiei and destroyer Atatsuki illuminate the light cruiser USS Atlanta. Almost immediately, Atlanta takes fire from the forward Japanese warships and responds by firing on the source of the searchlights in the darkness. In the confusion, Atlanta receives fire from the heavy cruiser San Francisco, killing Rear Admiral Norman Scott. Aflame and taking a torpedo hit, Atlanta drifts away and later sinks. Spotlighting Atlanta, Hiei and Atatsuki become the focus of heavy American fire. Atatsuki soon sinks with a significant loss of life. The forward American destroyers USS Cushing and Laffey launch torpedoes at Hiei, but they are fired at such short range that they cannot arm in time. They then pepper her superstructure with rapid gunfire, setting her alight and wounding Admiral Abe. USS Laffey is sailing so close to Hiei that she just misses a ramming by the big battlecruiser. Hiei is unable to lower her guns enough to hit the determined American destroyer. Fellow destroyer USS Sterett keeps up the attack on Hiei, but in turn becomes the focus of heavy Japanese fire and is forced to turn away. Lit in the night by the fire on her superstructure, Hiei becomes the target of 2 American heavy cruisers, USS San Francisco and Portland, who pummel her with 8-inch fire at very close range. One hit causes considerable flooding, forcing the crew to switch to manual steering. Hiei responds on San Francisco, killing her captain and Admiral Callahan, who would both be awarded posthumous Medals of Honor. Nevertheless, having taken an enormous amount of punishment, Hiei is shattered and is forced to retreat to the north. Almost simultaneously, light cruiser Nagara brings Cushing under crippling fire, and with destroyers Asagumo and Murasame joining in, Cushing's crew abandons ship. Astern of Cushing, Laffey is hit with withering fire from 3 Japanese destroyers, then by a 14-inch shell from a Japanese battlecruiser, destroying her and leaving most of her crew dead. At 1:58 am, destroyer Udachi launches a spread of torpedoes at the American cruisers, with one hitting heavy cruiser Portland, disabling her rudder and leaving her unable to do anything other than circle. Still, Portland keeps firing whenever she can. Destroyer Amatsukaze launches torpedoes against the rear 4 American destroyers. The USS Aaron Ward swerves to avoid Udachi, forcing USS Barton behind her to stop. She is quickly split in half by 2 torpedoes, taking most of her crew with her. The wounded Admiral Abe decides to cancel the bombardment at 2 am and to pull his force back. Battlecruiser Kirishima has taken negligible damage and is ordered away from Guadalcanal. However, this does not stop the fighting. Seeing Amatsukaze engaging San Francisco, light cruiser USS Helena engages her and quickly shatters her, forcing her to retreat. Destroyer USS Monson takes heavy fire by Japanese destroyers and light cruiser Nagara and sinks. Soon after, light cruiser USS Juno is knocked out of the fight by a torpedo, and in reply, Udachi is hit by a torpedo and unable to move. A few hours later, the still helplessly circling Portland finishes her off. As the sun rises on the 13th, the waters off Guadalcanal are the scene of pure carnage, as heavily damaged warships from both sides try to extricate themselves. Soon after 11 am, as the battered cruisers San Francisco, Helena and Juno leave the area, a Japanese submarine hits Juno with a torpedo, igniting her magazine and sending the 6,000-ton warship under in mere seconds, ultimately leading to the death of 683 of her 700 crew. Throughout the day, the Japanese try their best to protect the wounded Hiei and extricate her from the area, whilst at the same time, the Americans do everything they can to sink her. After numerous bomb and torpedo hits from American aircraft, the battlecruiser is abandoned and sinks in the early hours of the 14th. 1,439 American sailors have died stopping the Japanese bombardment of Henderson Field. 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers are sunk, and the 2 heavy cruisers are heavily damaged. In comparison, the Japanese have lost a battlecruiser and 2 destroyers, with 2 more heavily damaged. By preventing the bombardment of Henderson Field, Callahan's task force would, at great cost to themselves, give American aircraft the opportunity to devastate the Japanese transport convoy heading to Guadalcanal. But respite is fleeting, and the Japanese are far from finished. They are still determined to get their transport convoy safely to Guadalcanal, and so, at 1:30 am on the 14th of November, now with only cruisers and destroyers, the Japanese bombard Henderson Field. However, their bombardment is largely ineffective, and the next day American aircraft sink 6 of the transports and force another to retreat. After the failure of the previous night's sortie, another Japanese bombardment group of 1 battlecruiser and 2 heavy cruisers, with 2 light cruisers and 9 destroyers in support, is assembled under the command of Vice Admiral Kondo. Additional Japanese battlecruisers and heavy cruisers are in the area, but at this crucial juncture they are not brought forward. Over on the American side, with their cruisers crippled, Vice Admiral William Halsey makes the brave decision to commit 2 fast battleships supported by 4 destroyers to defend Henderson Field on the night of the 14th of November. Ultimately, Halsey has little else left with which to confront the Japanese at night. Under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, Halsey knows sending battleships USS Washington and South Dakota to Guadalcanal places them at huge risk of being torpedoed in the tight waterways around the island. Nevertheless, with their 16-inch guns and state-of-the-art radar-guided fire control systems, Washington and South Dakota possess the raw firepower to take on any Japanese warship. Lee knows the Japanese are on their way, as they have been spotted earlier in the day by an American submarine. In stark contrast, although Lee's force has been spotted by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, they keep misidentifying the battleships as cruisers, leading Japanese Commander Kondo to underestimate the threat he will soon be facing. As Lee sails his force east of Savo Island, a Japanese sweeping unit led by light cruiser Sendai with 3 destroyers moves in from behind, and with their excellent night optics, spot the Americans at 11:13 p.m. The destroyer Ayanami breaks off to check the waters west of Savo Island. Although the Japanese have spotted Lee's task force, they are still yet to realise the American force has battleships, not cruisers. Just after midnight, American radar picks up the Japanese sweeping unit, and after visually identifying the Japanese warships, the American battleships prepare to fire. Kondo orders the Japanese screening unit, led by light cruiser Nagara with 4 destroyers, to confront the American warships. At 11:17 p.m, Washington and South Dakota unleash a barrage of 16-inch shells at the Japanese sweeping unit, who promptly lay smoke and retreat from the area. Minutes later, Ayanami is picked up by the radar aboard USS Wolk and takes fire from 2 American destroyers and Washington's 5-inch guns. However, very soon after spotting Ayanami, USS Preston spots the Japanese screening unit led by Nagara, and along with 2 other American destroyers opens fire. Whilst their fire does little, Nagara's return fire quickly sets Preston aflame, and after her torpedoes explode, her captain orders abandon ship at 11:32. As Preston burns, a wave of Japanese torpedoes slam into the American destroyers, blowing the bow off both USS Benham and Wolk, which quickly sinks. USS Gwin flounders under Japanese gunfire. Lee's destroyer screen is being annihilated. Worse still, South Dakota is beginning to experience a string of crippling electrical faults that leave her temporarily unable to use her guns or radar. As a result, Washington is the only American vessel effectively remaining in the fight, and now she has Japanese battlecruiser Kirishima in her sights. But, unaware of where South Dakota is in the dead of the night, Lee holds Washington's fire, and instead orders damaged Gwin and Benham away, with Benham later being scuttled. As the fighting temporarily subsides, at 11:54 p.m, Kondo orders his bombardment group to move into position. Moments later, the Japanese screening unit reports sighting an American battleship, but Kondo ignores the report. Heavy cruiser Atago identifies South Dakota, illuminating the battleship with her searchlights. The entire Japanese bombardment group opens fire on South Dakota. Over a period of 4 minutes, she suffers considerable damage to her topside, yet luckily avoids the torpedoes launched at her. With their attention firmly on South Dakota, the Japanese fail to notice Washington moving into position to fire, and at midnight, Lee orders Washington to target battlecruiser Kirishima. Washington pummels Kirishima with devastatingly accurate fire, smothering her with 16-inch and 5-inch shells. Kirishima tries in vain to respond, but she can do little under the torrent of fire she is taking from Washington. Still not knowing where South Dakota is, and fearing friendly fire, Lee orders Washington to hold fire, leaving Kirishima crippled as fires and flooding begin to take hold. Firing hundreds of shells at the Japanese warships with little impact, South Dakota's captain begins to move her away from the battle. Now Washington faces the entire Japanese force, who are now manoeuvring to try and launch torpedoes against her. Whilst both sides continue to track each other, they hold fire so as not to expose themselves in the dead of night. At 12:13 a.m, Atago and Takao launch a wave of torpedoes at Washington, but all miss. At 12:32 a.m, Kondo finally cancels the bombardment of Henderson Field. Nevertheless, the Japanese continue to track Washington and launch torpedoes at her without success, and by 1:40 a.m, Washington slips out to the west of Guadalcanal. Soon after, the flooding becomes too much for Kirishima to take, and the mighty battlecruiser rolls over and sinks. A further 242 American sailors have died to defend Henderson Airfield this night. 3 destroyers have been sunk, and South Dakota has suffered substantial damage. 249 Japanese sailors have lost their lives. But whilst the American task force have sunk a Japanese battlecruiser and a destroyer, the real prize is protecting Henderson Field, so crucial to the war effort in the area. In the morning, American aircraft from Henderson destroy all the remaining Japanese transports, and with them the last Japanese effort to achieve victory at Guadalcanal. Whilst victory at Midway checks Japanese advances in the Pacific, it did not stop them, and instead it was the long and hard-fought victory at Guadalcanal that represented the beginning of the end of the Empire of Japan. Thanks to Drakenifel for providing rare images and research material for this confusing and chaotic battle. For knowledgeable and interesting naval history content, please check him out on YouTube.